Hello. Today I'm going to talk about another really interesting book that I read recently, which is Neil Price's History of the Vikings, the Children of Ash and Elm. And it's really interesting if you think about like Viking philosophy or ideas are all around us in public stories and film series, etc. So like you have Lord of the Rings, you have Game of the Thrones, and it's full of Viking mythology. But how much do we actually know about what Vikings really thought, felt, and how they organized their society? And one of the big challenges that we face is that everything that we have about Vikings is typically filtered through predominantly a Christian lens, or to some extent, as we find more sources, also through an Arabic lens. And so, what do we actually know about an empire that interacted and had contact with people like all the way from the Arctic all the way down to the Mediterranean and North Africa, and at some stage, like all the way over to what is today Canada, and all the way to like in the east, potentially even up to China, and like down to Iraq. So it was a massive imperial structure. And so like just two things that really struck me when I was reading the book, like how much what do we actually know about how Vikings saw themselves, like the psychology. We have all these kind of psychological theories about the self and who we are. And what seems to transpire is that actually Vikings had a very different way of thinking about themselves. So there was an outer shell, which I think was called Hammer. And you could, like your outer shell doesn't really tell you anything. Like you could, change your outer appearance, and it doesn't actually matter. So apparently race, ethnicity, those kind of questions were not a big issue for Vikings. So you have now increasingly evidence that Vikings were quite happy to take people from all, even quite likely people from Africa served as Vikings in their expeditions and in their conquests. And so we have the concept of shapeshifters in a lot of public, or a lot of stories these days. And then underneath you have who you really are, some kind of soul idea, which we don't really know that much about. And then there are two further ways of actually thinking about the Viking person, which were supposedly very central. The first one is the concept of Hamingja, which seems to be some kind of, like personification of your luck. So there are some stories that people just, for example, Vikings left a looming fight because they suddenly had the feeling that something happened to them where their Hamingja kind of left them. And another one that apparently is very important is the fourth layer is your ancestors. So there was a very strong link to ancestorship, so ancestor worship. There are lots of stories about ancestor worship from Vikings sagas and so on. So it seems like it's a very rich psychology, if you want, that is very different from Christian notions of the self, for example. And so one of the first really intriguing things about Vikings, once you start digging into it, is to what extent they are actually so different from like this kind of Christian like thought and self processes that were imposed in the last 1,000 years. And another thing that I think is really interesting, if you think about like the psychology and the social organization, like people always think about that first famous raid, in England, 793, when apparently 3 warships appeared and raided a monastery in England as the beginning of the Viking Age. But what does that actually mean? And people have started to break down what it means to build a warship and to fit out a group of warriors going over there. And it turns out it's a massive social undertaking, which requires a very long-term social horizon and really elaborate social organization and social structure to do that. So, just, like what we think happened. So, for example, for one warship, to get just the wool, because it was made from wool, so sheep, so I have to take care of sheep. So one sheep apparently has about 1 to 2.5 kg of wool. And a sail which we guess was about 18 square meters, like one sail, you need about 1 kg per square meter. So, like that's already a lot of sheep that you have to tend for a year. And so they estimate it's probably 2 years for one person to get all that wool together, like herding sheep for one sail. And typically you want to set sail with just one sail, right? So just think about like how much work goes in there to create that sail. So now if you think about, building the ship, like you have to plant the trees, like we know from historical records that, like in the Scandinavian parts, like apparently there was some kind of scarcity of trees after a certain point. And so you had to plant these trees. Trees grow 50, 60 years before you can actually fell them. And people reckon to build a single warship like this, like you had to have something like 2,650 person days for building the ship. And then you still have to get all the iron together, which apparently, like to get all the iron fittings for one ship is like 13,500 hours. Like this is a lot of work. This is so much work. And, that's just one rate. But, like it gives you an idea of how much was involved, how many people were involved, how much planning was involved to get one ship ready. And, like then it multiplies. And so it also gives a very different perspective now on these Viking raids and what motivates them in terms of just, like getting manpower, which is another, like thing that I didn't know about, like the extent of, like a system of slavery that was happening at that time. And also the linguistic kind of, because like the Vikings ultimately like conquered England, and so we have a lot of influences of Viking thoughts and words still in English. And like being betrothed, for example, which is like a kind of neutral term, right? But apparently it comes from being a thrall, which is being a slave. Right, so like there's a lot of baggage also here involved in that whole thing. And like what I really enjoyed about this book is it gave me a different perspective on a region, like in Europe, where you have a feeling you know a lot about it, but actually once you start digging, once you start taking away all these layers that have been imposed through about 1,000 years of Christian thought that has reinterpreted a lot of these sources and reinterpreted a lot of the objects that people have found. Once you start thinking about what may actually have been happening on how people thought, how they lived together, it's actually mind-blowing. And since I read this book, I often like question myself, so how would a Viking, how would they have thought about this, like with a very different worldview, like which ranged from very egalitarian structures all the way among like the bros, like the like this camaraderie around male partnership as they were going on raids, all the way to basically very complex gender relations, all the way to like a system of slavery. So like it's just such a complex worldview that is being lost, while we also have so much like ideas, so many thoughts, also words, values that are still related to that world, although they have taken on other meanings today. So I thought it was a fantastic book, absolutely amazing, mind-blowing. It's a bit of a reading. But yeah, it's super rich in details, and it gives you a very different perspective on a super fascinating, super exciting uh, period in human history, and that is worth, like learning a little bit more about.